Alexander Motyl is an American historian, political scientist, poet, writer, translator, and artist. He lives in New York and is a professor of political science at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. Alexander is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. He has taught at Columbia University, Lehigh University, the Ukrainian Free University, the Kyiv-Mohyla University, and Harvard as well. Aside from his academic work, he also writes opinion columns in publications such as Foreign Policy 45, The Hill, and the Kyiv Post. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content we produce, do help by supporting the channel to grow and expand its audience by becoming a patron or buy me a coffee. Alexander, this is the second time we've spoken, and I have to say the first video did exceptionally well, and it received some incredibly positive comments from the audience. So hopefully we will repeat that again today.
We'll certainly try. Thank you for having me, by the way.
Oh, well, it's an absolute delight. And of course, your knowledge of the region is invaluable, especially at a time like this, where what's happening in the Middle East is sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the media environment. And of course, you've written about that and commentators as well. I won't immediately point the finger at Russia, but certainly what's happening in the Middle East and the chaos around the world, that does benefit Moscow in some considerable fashion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a simple proposition. The more chaos, the better for Moscow. I mean, they want to unsettle the international order, the existing international order. They claim they want to replace it with some kind of more equitable division, but in fact, what they really want is to create chaos, to create unrest, which of course then enables them to do whatever it is they want to do in their own neighborhood and throughout the world. That's the danger.
And this paints it as a clash of not just sort of civilizational values or even sort of a geopolitical concept. Some of my speakers have started talking about this as essentially a clash of business models, because the rules-based order very much supports rules-based societies, exporting societies that add value to, produced goods, finished goods, which of course the US and its allies very much fit into that camp. Whereas Russia doesn't make an awful lot, but it does export raw materials. It also exports, as you say, chaos, arms, etc. So should we also be seeing this move to the so-called lawless or multipolar vision that Russia has as being very much supportive of its business model and how its elites make money?
Oh, that's a very good point. That's an excellent point, as a matter of fact. Russia, as you just mentioned, primarily exports raw materials, oil, gas, lumber, things of that sort. That's the majority of the GDP happens to be focused on those sectors. That certainly encourages an authoritarian form of rule because it guarantees Putin and his comrades in the Kremlin with easy money. They don't have to produce, they don't have to they don't have to add any particular value to products. And that, of course, enables them to sustain both the war as well as their authoritarian rule at home. It's in direct contradiction to, this kind of model, which you might also call a mafia model, there would be some truth to that too, stands in direct contradiction to everything that the West stands for and claims to stand for. And by the West, I mean countries all over the world that happen to adhere to some sense of liberal, democratic, market-oriented, free, just norms of some kind or other. And as you said, the Russians paint this as a form of multilateralism. They insist that the Americans are ruling the world, that they exert hegemony, and of course are responsible for everything bad in the world. But the solution to this that they propose is infinitely worse. Multilateralism simply means competition among states based on their own perceived and or real interests, and eventually becomes, if not immediately, then very quickly, a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, where life is nasty, brutal, and short for everybody concerned. So, as you say, it's not just a clash of civilizations. It is that, but it's also clearly a clash of these business models, as you put it. So it's a clash on many levels. I mean, this is one of the points I'm not sure that people in the West fully appreciate, that we're talking about, I mean, in this war that Ukraine is waging against Russia, or alternatively Russia against Ukraine, we're not just talking about a regional conflict that happens to be very bloody and taking the lives of thousands of people. We are talking about an existential struggle between, well, frankly, good and evil. I think I'd go, it sounds simplistic, but it's actually quite true. And it's an existential struggle that, at least to my mind, is reminiscent of the conflict that the West waged against Adolf Hitler back in the 1940s. It is of equal importance for the fate of the world.
And that lawlessness, I think, sits at the heart of it, not lawlessness and chaos for its own sake, but because it is beneficial to somebody. That, to me, and I know you've written about this, that makes it even less comprehensible to me why the so-called realist school of foreign policy theory sort of fails to see this. They see it as a proxy conflict between world powers, spheres of influence, etc., etc. But they seem to fail to identify this clash of fundamental values that underpins it. Why do you think the realists, I mean, is it out of naivety, or is there something a little more, dare I say it, sort of sinister going on?
I'd be inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, although I'm not sure with some of them. Certainly those policymakers and television commentators like Tucker Carlson, the American demagogue, as you probably know, he's a realist, and I'm not so sure that the word nefarious or sinister does not apply to him. I suspect it does. But the academics, people like Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer, and many others, I think their blindness is effectively a function of their theoretical predispositions. They see everything as a clash of billiard balls. That's the model that's often associated with the realist school. In other words, as a clash of interest amongst individual states. And that's useful as a starting point. It's nice to know which states are powerful, which are not, which have these resources, which have those, and so on. But it only sets a framework. Instead of simply accepting the framework and then moving on to look more closely at what's inside these so-called billiard balls, or within the state, within the government, they just leave it at that. So the clash between Russia and Ukraine is simply a clash between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is a stand-in for NATO, so it's really Russia versus NATO, end of story. And at that level, values, norms, democracy, liberalism, rule of law, none of these things seem to matter because they are internal to Russia. Well, rather, they're not internal to Russia, unfortunately. They are internal to Ukraine and the West. And it's because of this that they don't look at the nature of Russian ideology. They don't look at the nature of the Russian political culture. They don't look at Putin and the fact that he happens to be a dictator. What does that mean? How does that have an impact? How does that affect his policy towards Ukraine, his policy towards the rest of the world, as well as Russia? None of these questions matter. And of course, they're fundamental. They are absolutely fundamental. I mean, if one had to choose between adopting a purely realist perspective without any interest or without any focus on internal developments, or an exclusive focus on internal developments without any focus on billiard balls, then the latter would obviously be the superior choice. It tells you much more about why the war is going on, what the capacities of each country are, and so on. And again, the realists don't seem to see this, but because they're blinkered by their own theory. And to unblinker them is very hard, if not indeed impossible, but certainly very hard, because it requires a rejection by individuals who invested so much of their careers and lives in a particular theoretical perspective. So they'd have to reject this. That's hard. One can appreciate the dilemma of Stalinists who suddenly realize that Stalin was a monster. How do you deal with the fact that you spent all your life devoting yourself to a particular individual and ideology? And again, I don't want to compare realism with Stalinism, but the difficulty of overcoming that kind of theoretical blindness is hard. It's very, very hard.
And of course, it denies agency to an extent. If you take those values out as being actually a driving factor, superficially things may make sense, but actually they don't, because if there isn't agency, if there isn't these liberal values that people are fighting for, or even concept of rule of law, etc., then actually Russia would have been correct, and it would have been victorious, and it would have rolled over Ukraine in 10 days, as the Moscow plan has said, because there'd be no values. It wouldn't make a difference to the local population, whether it was Zelensky or Moscow or whoever. It would all be the same. There's nothing to fight for. It's the fact that this agency exists explains, one, how Moscow's strategy is so flawed, but secondly, how Ukraine has managed to survive far, far, far longer than any of the pundits or theories predicted. Why is it then that the realists seem to have been entrenched further in their positions rather than re-examining it? We're coming up to the second anniversary of the war, and their theories seem to have no explanatory power at this point.
Well, I think the answer, one of the answers is the one that I just gave you, that, since one's career and existential existence, as it were, has been so tightly bound to a realist perspective, it's just hard to give up. That said, they do insist, they have insisted, and they continue to insist, that the ultimate winner, again, notice, the ultimate winner, in the final analysis, when push comes to shove, you can use any number of appropriate metaphors here. In the final analysis, Russia will indeed prevail. They do believe that. They still continue to believe that. And then how do you explain the fact that Ukraine managed to put up such a resistance? Well, it wouldn't be due to values. It wouldn't be due to voice, agency, or any of these things, because that undermines their own theoretical perspective. It's due to the fact that there was a miscalculation on the part of the Russians, and to some degree on the part of the Westerners, regarding the degree to which the Ukrainians had a functioning army, and the degree to which the Russian army was indeed the second best army in the world. And that you can kind of fit into the realist perspective. So, one can always say, well, it's not just numbers, it's numbers plus the quality of leadership. That fits. So they make those kinds of arguments. So there was a miscalculation on the part of a variety of individuals and countries, but as that song in My Fair Lady goes, just you wait, Henry Higgins, just you wait, right? They'll be right in the final analysis.
Yeah, or I'm sure they'll find a way to pivot, even if they turn out not to be. Another perhaps overlooked factor of a personal dictatorship of the kind that Putin has constructed is the role of secrecy, conspiracy, rumor, which seems to take a sort of frightening hold of people's minds. It's also used by the propagandists to try and blunt people's action and decision-making process, deny them any sense of agency as well. And we have a classic example of that emerging this week, and that is the video of Patrushev's oration, which seems to be almost a funerary oration, as if Putin is no more. That video reviews his so-called achievements, etc., but exclusively talks about him in the past tense. You've written about this. I find this a deeply bizarre video, and really wonder what on earth is going on.
Welcome to the wonderful world of criminology. which, as you know, consists of, one part knowledge, one part guesswork, one part hope, one part something else. A lot of this, I mean, the business that you're referring to, the Patrushev speech, the fact that in the last week alone, he gave 4 public presentations, whereas he usually gives 1 per half year. All of this seems to be connected in some bizarre way with claims made by a Telegram site called General SVR. SVR stands for the Foreign Security Service. And a Russian academic, former academic, current political analyst by the name of Valery Solovey. And they've been insisting for months, if not longer, that A, Putin is deathly ill, B, that he has 2 and possibly as many as 3 doubles who stand in for him in a variety of occasions. And last but not least, and this is by far the most important claim they made, they insist that on October 26th at 8:40 p.m., if I'm not mistaken, Putin, the real Putin, died. And the doctors who were present at his deathbed were then sequestered and then told what to say or what not to say, then finally released. And in the meantime, so they say, the real Putin has been residing in the refrigerator. I mean, this just gets more and more bizarre. In his bunker in Valdai. So hence, again, according to this version, Patrushev is now really the man in charge. And if he is in fact the man in charge, and if in fact Putin has been in some fashion or other either killed, dead, died, or has been debilitated, that would arguably explain why he's suddenly been appearing so often in public presentations. It would also arguably explain why he gave this funerary oration dedicated to Putin. Now, these are controversial claims, as you can well imagine. And most people don't believe that he's dead, although most people do insist, at least on the websites I've been following, that they would like to see him in that particular position. A lot hinges, of course, on the question of whether doubles really do exist. And there seems to be a consensus. Well, there was a consensus, say, a few months ago that, well, this was just hearsay, this was just Solovey mouthing off, it couldn't possibly be true. My impression from the readings that I've been doing is that this now seems to have been accepted by all manner of analysts, obviously short of the propagandists. So in other words, he seems to have at least 2 doubles, one of whom has been appearing in a variety of places, in a variety of negotiating settings. And apparently, and this is another one of these bits of indirect evidence, as Solovey puts it, of Putin's demise, this fake Putin has been going around and mouthing off in a very embarrassing and indeed idiotic way. And presumably the real Putin wouldn't be acting in that manner. What struck me in watching the real fake Putin, again, I have no idea who this person is anymore, is that in most of his public presentations where he's just speaking extemporaneously, he's hemming and hawing and taking very deep breaths. This is very different from the real Putin of a number of years ago, who spoke with self-confidence and a certain degree of vigor and command. This seems like either a very ill Putin or a very different Putin, but in any case, not quite the man who's supposed to be. Anyway, this is the story behind all this. Since there seems to be a real double, and apparently a Japanese outfit researched this, they found some experts, so this seems to have the imprimatur of whoever it is these Japanese researchers seem to be. That, of course, makes the possibility of Putin's demise much more plausible, because that's the guy we're seeing before us as he addresses a variety of places and speaks to various audiences. It still seems unlikely that he died. But, and again, I'm not persuaded, but I'd like to be, of course. but what gives me some pause is that Solovey is a very serious individual. His analyses of internal Russian politics, short of this business on Putin's death, is usually right on, it's spot on, it's persuasive. Even when I disagree, I got to admit, this guy is smart. And in a way, what he's doing is betting his entire career, all his credibility on this particular fact or non-fact. So if it turns out not to be true, he essentially will be completely discredited. Of course, if it turns out to be true, he'll probably be running for president in March. But that's the story. And of course, it's just reflective of the sort of the bizarreness of internal Russian politics. And one can, append to this the whole story, the whole business with Mr. Prigozhin, the failed mutiny, as the Russians call it. I'd prefer to call it a coup. Why did he stage it? Why did he stop? And more importantly, why didn't the FSB, the secret police in the army, who had to have known in advance that something like this was taking place, why didn't they stop him? Why did they apparently encourage him? All this seems to suggest, and the business with Solovey and Putin's putative death does so as well. All of this suggests that there are certain divisions, cracks, fragmentations, conflicts, call them what you like, within the Russian elite. We have other, political analysts, Russians and non-Russians, Westerners, Europeans, Americans, who say that they've seen that too. They have evidence of this as well. All of this suggests that Putin, whether alive or dead, is in some kind of very serious trouble, and that the regime is perhaps on the doorstep of some kind of, more than just a casual fragmentation, but possibly a raskol, a split down the middle. That would be interesting, and that would be extremely significant, because were it to happen, perhaps it's already happening, but were it to happen with full force, that would presumably, at least for the period of the power struggle, would presumably distract Russia from the war in Ukraine, at least to some degree, and perhaps incline whoever it is that eventually comes to power. Hopefully it'll be the conservative liberals, call them what you like. It might incline them to seek some kind of resolution to the war.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it? And I know a lot of the coverage in criminology focuses on the interaction of individuals. It focuses on the sort of conspiracies, who said whom to what, and that kind of thing. But actually, the underlying story is terrifying, isn't it? Because here you have a system that is so opaque, so inaccessible, you can't really know what's true and false and what's not going on. Also, one has to ask whether it's Putin or his doubles, does it actually make any difference? Because it seems that this is an aggressive regime that's sort of been on an escalation autopilot since February last year. Nothing has blunted them from continuing their pointless aggression, and at every opportunity where they have the strength to do so, they scale up. You don't need to be a strategic mastermind or even the real Putin to potentially carry on with this autopilot strategy that really seems to have been in place right from the start of the full-scale invasion.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The only thing I would add to this is, if Solovey's scenario is true and Putin is dead, and if Russia is currently being ruled by a double, and mind you, these are two big ifs, but if they happen to be true, then the question is, to what degree and for how long will this double be able to play the role of Putin internally, domestically? In terms of his public presentations, in terms of his meetings with people, presumably indefinitely. But Putin's role within this autocratic, I call it a fascist system that he constructed, was, first of all, he was the linchpin. He held all the strings, as it were. But at the same time, he played a very important role, similar to that of Hitler in Germany and similar to that of dictators in any other country. He balanced the competing interests and the competing voices. He was the man who made the ultimate decision in favor of one approach or another, of some compromise. This double, whoever he is, and apparently he's not exactly a member of the former intellectual class, is obviously not in that same position. He doesn't have the authority, he doesn't have the legitimacy. And the question then is, if in fact the double is the person who is acting in place of Putin, when will his ability to serve a purpose, namely serve as a kind of interim leader, when will that run out? My guess is, well, first of all, I don't know, of course, but my guess is that the Russian elites, including Putin if he's alive, and this double if he's the person in charge, they have to make the decision by the March 2024 presidential elections. If the real Putin is ill, well, he could still run. He may not be a terribly attractive candidate, but he'll get 90% either way. It doesn't matter. But it would be bizarre. It would be really, truly bizarre if the powers that be, permitted this double to run in place of Putin. In a way, that would be admitting defeat. And someone like Patrushev, well, any of these guys, but especially someone like Patrushev, would certainly be disinclined to do that. But ultimately, I think what is, the thrust of your question is, or the thrust of your comment rather, is that Putin has constructed this kind of monstrous system. As I said, I call it fascist. Other people call it totalitarian. Some others call it Stalinist. Whatever the term, it's a very closed, it's a hyper-centralized system. It's profoundly aggressive. It thrives on mendacity. And it has imperialist aspirations. It's a profoundly dangerous system. Regardless of what one calls it, I think we can all agree that it has these particular dangerous characteristics. And of course, that means, I think, when one sees it in this, when one sees the system in its entirety, one begins to appreciate as well that Ukraine is just the first stop. Russia isn't going to stop with Ukraine. There are other, possibly juicier fruits for it to pick. If I were the Balts, I'd be very afraid. If I were the Poles, I'd be very worried. If I were Kazakhstan, I'd be very worried. And I can easily imagine, not just imagine, I'm absolutely certain that if Ukraine doesn't stop Russia, Russia will not be stopped.
And that's the terrifying prospect, isn't it? And I wonder, again, if we come back to the strategic thinking behind the realist model, it seems to be that despite all this extraordinary potential for a split within Russia, the extraordinary brittleness, fragility, and I dare say it, the system, which is not a productive system at this point, it's more of a parasitic vertical than something that benefits its economy or citizenry, we still seem to be thinking about Russia as something that is too big to fail. We seem to be still imagining a world order in which Russia cannot play a part, and yet it is clearly this incredibly divisive element. Are we repeating the same failure of strategic imagination that we were in just prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, where people were confidently predicting that it'll last forever and it's not that fragile after all, and the next day, in the blink of an eye, it collapses?
Yes, I mean, I think, the analogy you just drew is absolutely spot on. There is a failure of imagination on two levels. One is this inability to imagine that a superpower, and of course the Soviet Union was a superpower. I'm not so sure about Russia anymore, but let's call it a superpower just for the sake of argument. But it was the inability to imagine that a superpower could actually collapse, as it were, implode. I mean, people often talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union as having been brought about by the Pope and Afghanistan. Well, they played a bit role in the process. Ultimately, it was the internal forces of the Soviet Union that brought it down, and the demons, as it were, that were unleashed by Gorbachev. And in that sense, there was little that we could have done to stop it, and there was little that we could have done to promote. Well, could have done a little bit, but not much. It was essentially internally driven. And we see the same thing going on today. This inability to imagine that the Russian Federation could fail as a state, could perhaps even collapse. And again, we're enamored, as we were then, by the leader. I mean, Gorbachev seemed to have everything under control. In fact, he was losing control with every day. Again, Putin, who's hardly comparable to Gorbachev in terms of values, was also, again, we seem to believe that since Putin is around, nothing can possibly change, nothing will change, and the system will continue to survive. So you're absolutely right. There is this inability to imagine a future without Russia. But more than that, I'd go a step further. Again, many, if not most policymakers continue to believe not only that Russia will survive, but that Russia must survive. And here, I think we're coming up against the key issue. And that begins to have, and of course, that has a very serious impact on the Russo-Ukrainian war. Because if Russia must survive, in some fashion or other, then Russia must not lose, or at least must not lose terribly to Ukraine, which is to say that Ukraine must not win overwhelmingly. Maybe it should win, sort of, kind of win, but not in a forceful, genuine, and lasting manner. And I think that accounts for the hesitancy with which the West in general, and particular countries in particular, have been providing armaments to Ukraine. They eventually provide much of what they promise, but it's always eventually, so it's always a little too little and a little too late. And we see that today, or at least we saw that in the last few months. The Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive. Had they had the requisite equipment, it could have been more successful than it's been thus far. By the way, it hasn't been utterly as unsuccessful as depicted, but that's a topic for another conversation, perhaps. But the bottom line is that had Ukraine these armaments, had Ukraine these weapons, the planes, the tanks, and everything else in the appropriate amounts, we'd probably see a very different front line. We might have seen a collapse of the front in some particular places. All these things become possible, but precisely because it seems to me the West hasn't fully persuaded itself that Russia must not win, must not lose. Is that right? Yes, must not lose. We get this dripping effect where aid is provided, but never quite in sufficient amounts, and never quite in the timely manner.
And that echoes phrases we heard from Macron right at the start of the war, which is Russia mustn't be humiliated unless you listen to experts like yourself, Keir Giles, and others, repeatedly, right from the start, making the point that humiliating Russia in a short, sharp, decisive victory is exactly the way to reduce the risk. So do you see the current scenario of incrementalism as actually increasing not just the suffering on the Ukrainian side, which always has to be remembered, but increasing the risk from the entire situation, the risk of this conflict growing and expanding to encompass, more regions, more countries?
Absolutely. The problem is that the longer all of this takes, the more of a grind that it becomes. The willingness on the part of the West to continue helping Ukraine will probably decline. I mean, there is already talk of, quote, a never-ending stalemate. How can a stalemate that's only lasted for 2 months be called a never-ending is another issue, but be that as it may, there's already a projection of the stalemate into the future. And of course, if it is indeed the case that there will be a stalemate, and if we were to know that with absolute certainty, uncertainty, then it makes absolute sense to negotiate some kind of deal today, rather than waiting for thousands more to be killed and negotiating the same kind of deal a year or two from now. Of course, we don't know that there's going to be a stalemate, and as I've said, I don't think there is one at present, but that's another issue.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on that theme, because stalemate is something that the press has picked up on. Obviously, Zaluzhny's article, which actually was a lot more nuanced than just the headline word stalemate that's been picked out. It's an easy narrative for the press to pick up on, and it has historical echoes and so on. But picking up on your point there, how accurate is that? Because we've got an extraordinary series of attacks by Ukraine on the Black Sea Fleet. We've got Ukraine regaining a degree of control over the Black Sea area, which is extraordinary, and a vast offensive action in Avdiivka, which has been repelled with huge Russian losses. The word stalemate doesn't really cover what is happening on the ground, does it?
No, I think the points you made are just are very, on the mark. When people talk about stalemate, they generally look at the map, with a particular, particularly sized map. And then they notice that the parts in red are still the parts in red. The parts in blue are still blue, with the red standing for the Russians, the blue standing for the Ukrainians. And it looks like nothing has changed over the last few months. But as you say, first of all, there is the issue of the Black Sea Fleet, which the Ukrainians have managed to drive out of Sevastopol and the Crimea. This is a remarkable thing, especially considering that Ukraine has no navy. But it succeeded in that. And that's not just symbolically important. That opens up the passages for Ukrainian grain to be exported via Romania or Turkey. It means that it's further, that firing missiles from these boats is now a question of it requires a longer flight, a longer distance, and hence makes it relatively easier, at least somewhat easier, for Ukrainians to shoot them down. So this is very important, both symbolically as well as tactically and strategically. There's also, unfortunately, continued Russian dominance of the area. Again, that's the other side of the ledger. And one of the reasons why people like Mr. Peskov, who's Mr. Putin's spokesperson, believes that there is no stalemate. But of course, he's arguing this from the perspective of the Russian side. And then last but not least, there is in fact movement on the front. The Russians have moved incrementally in the northeast. They're trying to capture Avdiivka, and they've been doing this for the last few weeks, if not months, and their losses are horrendous. And of course, the usual response to this is, well, Putin doesn't care. Well, I'm sure that's true, but at some point, one has to figure that some Russians will begin caring. Being treated as cannon fodder is presumably not an advantageous, career choice, so to speak. More important, even than that, however, is that if one looks at the areas in the south, the front line on the south, the Ukrainians have been making steady progress. Again, it's incremental, but it's steady and incremental progress. And just recently, they've started making steady and incremental progress in crossing the Dnipro River near Kherson province. And what that suggests is that their plan is to cut the Russian forces in two. Again, that would be the ideal goal. Minimally, the plan that they seem to have in mind for the foreseeable few months, especially the winter months, is to reduce the provision of supplies to the Russian troops based in Kherson province. That seems perfectly doable because it doesn't require a complete cutoff, just a significant cutoff. And that, of course, explains why the Ukrainians have been targeting all of this infrastructure, roads, railroads, gasoline depots, and things like that over the last few months. So again, we don't know what will happen, but what's happening at the moment suggests anything but a stalemate. There's a lot of dynamism. It's just that we don't quite see it. It's not dramatic. We haven't seen any major breakthroughs, But I personally could imagine something like a Ukrainian breakthrough in the south in the coming months, especially if the Ukrainians do succeed in isolating the Russian troops in Kherson and thereby making them more demoralized, more incapable of fighting. This is important because, of course, even if one believes that a stalemate is in fact the reality is also that the stalemate came about, or at least this perceived stalemate came about, as a result of this incremental approach to supplying weapons to Ukraine. There would have been no real or imagined stalemate had these weapons deliveries been significantly greater in the last few months. And there would be no stalemate in the immediate future, say within the next half year to year, if weapons deliveries were to be ramped up. And that again brings to mind why, providing this kind of assistance and doing it now rather than waiting half a year or a year from now is so critically important. Not only are we talking about Ukrainian and Russian lives, but we are talking about stopping the Russians. We're talking about a defeat of the Russian army and of the Russian political system. Even more important than defeating the Russian army is defeating the political system and Mr. Putin, and showing to the Russians that an alternative is actually possible, and that their embracing of, that their love affair with imperialist ideology and with this political culture that's so authoritarian needs to be revised. And the Russians will only do that. They will only embark upon some kind of fundamental revision, a fundamental rethink of their norms and values if they lose, preferably if they lose badly. That opens up doors to a rethinking of ideology and culture. That opens up possibilities for the coming to power of more liberal, more democratic, or at least rationally conservative forces. If that doesn't happen, there's no reason to expect Russia to change its strategic ideology, its strategic thinking, and its imperialistic goals.
And another very fertile area for Russian propaganda and, I guess, psyops to work is to convince us that a decisive victory would be terrible because Russia might turn around and do terrible things. It might deploy nuclear weapons. It might sort of do all sorts of other stuff. They also use the narrative that whoever replaces Putin could be far, far worse. These narratives, to those who are close, seem fairly absurd, but they do seem to cut through. What, however, do you think is the most likely scenario of a defeated Russia? Is it a sort of a nuclear option, or are they likely to retreat, lick their wounds, and spin the defeat as a victory? How do you think they would go in reality?
I'm somewhat sanguine about the prospects of a defeat. Of course, I don't know anything for certain, but my guess is that a defeated Russia would result in the coming to power of let's call them the democratic conservatives or the quasi-democratic quasi-conservatives. But in any case, the people who were more or less reasonable, who want some kind of resolution of the war, who want to normalize relations with Ukraine, Russia's neighbors, and especially the West. This group does seem to exist, so it's not just a figment of my imagination. They would come to power in all likelihood, precisely because the hawks would be the ones who would be held responsible for the defeat. And they would be responsible for the defeat. Whether it's in the person of Mr. Putin or whether it's in the person of Mr. Patrushev, they would be the ones who'd be held responsible by the elites and increasingly by the masses, by the population in general. So I'm inclined to think that they would come to power. I'm not sure that that would end the power struggle. My guess is that there would continue to be a significant power struggle based simply on the Soviet and Russian historical record. I mean, it could last 2, 3, 4, possibly even longer years, that is to say. And that would be a period of some uncertainty. I don't see the Russians using nuclear weapons against anybody in that kind of scenario. I do see both competitors, and there might be a third faction as well, but let's just keep it simple and speak of two sides, trying to appeal to various constituencies with the populations. Let's call them the hardliners versus the softliners. That could mobilize, that would probably lead to some degree of mobilization of the population, demonstrations, marches, potentially violence, potentially civil violence, potentially civil war. But that would be focused on Russia internally. Russia would have been defeated. It won't be in the position to engage in outward aggressions. It would have to focus on bringing order into its own house. To my mind, that would be a pretty good scenario, a pretty good outcome. A weakened Russia, a sobered Russia that would focus on its own problems and presumably would be inclined to search for solutions that would bring it back into the world, not just the world of China and North Korea, but the world in its entirety. Now, again, one could spin off additional scenarios. One can imagine a variety of non-Russian groupings trying to succeed and possibly trying to secede and possibly succeeding. But I think in general, this kind of weakened Russia focused on itself, on its own internal developments, on its own internal problems, would be a Russia that would not be inclined to be aggressive and that would leave its neighbors more or less alone. And that would be good. I think the Balts would breathe a sigh of relief, certainly the Ukrainians and Belarusians, certainly the Kazakhs and other Central Asians as well.
And the last question, and this is coming back again to the thread throughout this, which is, are we forcing Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind their back? And we've covered the battlefield, the regular battlefield arena, but there's also an irregular side. That is the assassination of officials who collaborate, Russian army officers. It's the drone attacks we saw a few months ago on areas like Rublyovka, outside Moscow, and of course the Free Russian legions who were, dare I say it, let loose in Belgorod to stir up sort of chaos, and to an extent Prigozhin as well. You know, we suspect perhaps that Ukraine may have had some heads up this was going on, and it all filters into an irregular warfare strategy that could perhaps short circuit a Ukrainian victory and achieve it faster. There has been a noticeable tapering off of these regular activities. Do you fear that we are behind the scenes putting pressure on Ukraine, again, not to engage in these activities for fear of destabilizing Great Russia, etc.?
I'm not so sure about that. Or rather, I'm pretty sure that that wouldn't be the case. I mean, there might be certain leaders of certain countries that have second thoughts about the wisdom or the humanity of these kinds of actions, but I haven't encountered anything in my readings or research that would suggest that this is becoming a dominant view. As to the tapering off, I mean, well, yes, in some respects, and no in some others. I mean, just 2 days ago, was it 1 day ago, a collaborationist was killed in his, this was in Luhansk. A bomb exploded in his car. About a week and a half ago, another collaborator by the name of Tsarilov was attacked and almost killed. So these sorts of assassinations are taking place, perhaps with somewhat diminished enthusiasm, but certainly they're still taking place. I mean, they haven't dropped off entirely. And the attacks by drones, those are still taking place. Moscow hasn't been targeted in a while. The Russian liberation forces don't seem to have been active in a while as well. And there, I think you're absolutely right. I'm not sure what the reasons for that is. I'm guessing, but this is purely a guess, that it has something to do with the fact that having targeted and struck a number of places in Moscow, the Ukrainians made a point and presumably feel that there's no additional reason to remake that point. But I don't know that for a fact. But this is likely to continue at whichever level of activity. The man who leads the special forces is fairly competent. His name is Kirill Budanov. Well, he's very competent. He seems to know exactly what he's doing, and they've established an entire network. What's striking to me, what's important to me, isn't even so much the fact that the assassinations and the explosions are taking place, although that's obviously impressive at a certain level. But what's more significant is that all of these actions are taking place with the assistance and occasionally on the initiative of locals. So it's not just Spetsnaz, special forces being sent in from Kiev to cause, to foment trouble in particular regions. They're doing this in conjunction with local resistance groups. And that's actually arguably more important, because as long as these groups are around and as long as Kiev has an interest in causing trouble, that trouble will be there. And it's, of course, the other point that's important to keep in mind is there is a logic to the way in which the Ukrainians have been targeting factories, plants, infrastructure. They're not doing it randomly, and they're not just picking the juiciest targets. They're picking the targets that make Russia and Russian forces, especially in Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces, especially vulnerable to disruptions in supplies and disruptions in ammunition. So that's continuing. And again, it's now become a fundamental part of the Ukrainian strategy. I could imagine that were there to be a reduction of Western armaments and assistance to Ukraine, the Ukrainians would perhaps withdraw their forces to safer positions along a front line, possibly. But at the same time, they would probably increase their guerrilla activity within, in the occupied parts of Ukraine.
So on balance, I know we're coming to the end. Everything you described there is actually deeply fascinating. It suggests that the idea of stalemate and failure really doesn't cover either the situation, or indeed, if there was a reduction in Western support, Ukraine would still have extraordinary capability to carry on its offensive actions, albeit they would morph somewhat. So on balance, do you feel that Ukraine has the upper hand at this point, despite the terrible losses that are being sustained?
Absolutely. I remain, optimistic, albeit cautiously optimistic, but clearly it has the upper hand. I mean, I just saw a piece today in The Economist. They calculate that Ukraine has lost 70,000 servicemen and women, that's to say, have been killed. Estimates of Russian losses go as high as 300,000. They might be 200,000, but the Ukrainians insist that their numbers are, Zelensky just made this point a few days ago, that Ukrainian losses are 1/5 of Russian losses. I'm not sure if that's true, but that would suggest that it's about 350 vis-a-vis 70,000. Whatever the point, whatever the numbers are, clearly they are very much imbalanced. And very much in favor of Ukraine. Of course, given the size of Russia, given the relative size of Ukraine, these are still very high numbers. But even so, on the battlefield alone, Ukrainians are doing fairly well. What makes me optimistic, cautiously optimistic, is that I can step back from this kind of narrow realist perspective, because if you just focus on guns and bombs, it's hard to be optimistic. The Russians simply have more of everything. But one steps back, one looks at the resilience and the commitment and the morale of the Ukrainians, the lack of resilience, the lack of commitment, and the lack of morale on the part of the Russians. And to my mind, the most important part is when I look at the regime in Russia, when I look at Mr. Putin, I see a brittle, crumbling regime and a brittle, crumbling dictator. Alive or dead, it doesn't really matter at this point. And when one looks at the whole picture, a picture that goes beyond the narrow strategic focus of the realist and looks at the domestic regime, the domestic economy, which we haven't talked about and isn't doing very well. When one looks at Mr. Putin and the way in which these factors, these domestic factors, interact with the ability of Russia to conduct a successful war in Ukraine, then I come away thinking, well, this is actually looking pretty good. Because I don't see the same brittleness on the Ukrainian side. I don't see the same fatigue on the Ukrainian side. I don't see the same losses, certainly not in personnel, as well as not in tanks, missiles, and other sorts of things. There's more suffering on the Ukrainian side, more civilian suffering. That's true. But when it comes to the battlefield, it seems to me that the Ukrainians are actually in a pretty good position. It could be much better. And it would have been much better. And again, let me end on this point. If the West had simply provided more and more timely assistance. But as long as it continues at current levels, I think Ukraine will manage well enough to continue making these incremental advances, especially in the South where it matters, and possibly to surprise us with the collapse of the Russian front in Kherson province in the months to come.
That's an incredibly strong place to end, and it's sometimes unusual to end on a note of optimism, but I think that's certainly not misplaced. Alexander, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I know you follow a lot of what's happening incredibly closely, so it's a privilege to be able to put these questions to you, and I know the audience are going to appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks to your audience for listening to my rants and ravings.